Scripture reading this evening will be taken from Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4 it says, "By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh."
Thank you, brother. And so grateful to be back with you all this afternoon, and what a blessing it is we have to study this topic once again and to look a little bit more closely at the tragedy of losing an adult child, something that is difficult and has catastrophic consequences, can be obviously life-altering and changing. And comment was made by sister on the way out this morning, said, hey, you either become better from something like that or bitter from something like that. And so much of our Christian walk is that way. So much of what we endure and go through from a trial perspective is that way. We either become increasingly stronger in our relationship with God and increasingly more faithful and diligent and fine-tuned, or we fall even farther away and become more and more detached and discouraged and numb as it relates to our relationship with God. And obviously, what we are doing this week, what we did last week leading up to today, and what we are doing today is a culmination of a series of lessons that will hopefully strengthen us if this were to ever come about our lives, or if it were to ever come about the life of one that we know, one that we love and care for, neighbors, friends, other family members, those within the community that we get to engage with, and that we would be better equipped to understand and be properly granted the tools necessary so that we can respond in a way that would be healthy and beneficial to them and ultimately bring God glory. And we looked at this morning with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and obviously having a thankful heart, a thankful mind in terms of such a difficulty. And I want us to just level set to an extent in terms of any type of trial, and this one is no different, as it relates to the opportunity to grow and strengthen ourselves in our relationship with God. So you think about what the Proverbs writer writes, for example, in Proverbs chapter 24 and in verse 10. He writes, "If you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small." And so I want you to think about adversity coming about, trial coming about, challenges coming about. And in that moment, it's actually that moment to be activated in our faith. It's to be activated in the gospel, to apply it more than ever before in that moment. But sometimes what we do and what we are tempted to do is, when that moment of adversity comes, to retreat. When that moment of adversity comes, it is then that we begin to clam up and potentially go backwards. And so God is telling us here that in the day of adversity, our strength is to be in our faith. And our faith in the gospel, our allegiance to the gospel, then enables us to be strong and to maintain perseverance through such difficulty. Think also what the psalmist writes in Psalm 66 and in verse 10. Psalm 66 and verse 10, he writes, "For you, O God, have tested us. You have refined us as silver is refined." Now, I've never experienced anything like this in regards to the actual trade or practice of refining silver, but I've seen a couple videos, and obviously with documentaries and YouTube and different videos that we're exposed to, you might be familiar with that clip where you see extremely hot, almost lava-looking like material in some type of oven, and then it comes out and it's poured, and then it begins to create and make some type of useful metal or a luxurious metal, whatever maybe we're thinking about in terms of how that's made in that process. Here, in the context of Psalm 66 and verse 10, is discussing silver. And obviously, silver is valuable. It has value. It is something that can have monetary value. It is something that can be used and exchanged. And we, as mankind, associate value with it. Well, in order to become valuable for God's service and kingdom, we likewise are refined. we have opportunities in those difficulties to actually embrace and embody the gospel even more. And so, of course, no one wants a trial. I don't know of anyone who raises their hand in the morning and says, I can't wait for trials to come into my life. But at the same time, when they come in, the Christian actually responds and says, wait a second, this is a growth opportunity. This is an opportunity to become increasingly more valuable for God and His kingdom. Let's think a little bit about what God says as it relates to His Old Testament servants, specifically Jeremiah. And this passage has always fascinated me. This is a passage that is one of those tough love passages that really lights a fire in my life because God is directly dealing with the temptation of mankind to begin to feel sorry for himself, to begin to wallow in our own self-pity and start to think, well, you know, woe is me, this is such a difficult situation and I'm all by myself and how can I be expected ever to get out of this? God says to Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 12 and in verse 5, He says, if you have run with the footmen and they have wearied you, how can you contend with horses? And if in the land of peace in which you trusted they wearied you, then how will you go in the floodplain of the Jordan? I mean, that's God essentially challenging Jeremiah and saying, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You think this is tough, just wait. And when we go through trials and difficulties, obviously a tragedy such as losing an adult child, as we discussed this morning, one of the most difficult things to do is to be thankful and to find actual opportunities by which it can improve our walk with God and improve His kingdom. But in actuality, the opportunity for us to go through that process equips us and enables us in a very specialized and unique way to provide service in God's kingdom in ways that most other people cannot do when we're talking about the context of something like this. And with that in mind, we then have the understanding regarding purpose. In other words, what is it that I'm really learning here? What is it that I'm being trained to understand here? And with these verses and these previous thoughts in mind, we're able to persevere because we recognize, hey, this is making me better. There's going to be something maybe in my future that I'm not even aware of that now, because I'm going through this today, wow, I will be in the position to be able to respond the way that I need to respond. It reminds me a little bit as well of the military. There was recently a tragic event for Marines training, and one passed. And sadly, this happens in training scenarios where military men and women, as they are training and preparing for warfare, there are occasions where accidents happen or the training is so difficult to the point where they pass. And the defense in that context by those that were former Marines as well as Marines is training is nothing compared to warfare. Those men and women signing up are signing up to go into warfare. And so the training, as difficult as it can be, is actually in preparation for something that is much worse. And so with that in mind, the soldier then is able to endure knowing, hey, I'm just getting ready for the real deal. And brethren, when we're able to take on a trial with that in mind, we then find and understand the purpose. And now all of a sudden, we realize, hey, I'm actually experiencing something here that's going to make me even better in terms of being able to glorify God in my life. And that's meaningful. That can assist us as we strive to cope with such situations. One of the ways in which we might be able to serve is dealing with and engaging with, depending upon where we sit as it relates to the familial construct, the children that are left behind from the adult child. And that is where we find this particular lesson this afternoon. Through them, He still speaks. In other words, through the surviving children, the adult child still speaks in the sense that those children are manifestations and in many ways have very similar traits and characteristics and similar personalities to that of the adult child that's passed. And I want you to think about a little bit of what the author wrote as we discussed his son, Matt, Brother Steve Baggett, writing of Matt in this series of lessons. And Thursday's lesson is this one, Through Them He Still Speaks. And I want you to think about what he wrote here concerning Matt. Matt still speaks today through Lane, who has his love for and innate ability to easily work with technology. When Matt would answer a question for me about technology, he would usually begin by saying, "Dad, you probably won't understand this, but the reality is that most of the time he was correct." Well, Brother Baggett is saying that in Lane, the child, the son of Matt, that he has similar interests and capabilities regarding his understanding of technology to that of Matt. John Stephen, so another grandchild of Steve Baggett and a surviving child of Matt, says John Stephen, who is extremely talented in working with numbers, having a quick recall and his love for climbing on just about anything. Matt was an excellent mathematician, was a member of his high school FBLA parliamentary procedure team, which, by the way, won a national championship. And as a child, Matt climbed on anything he could find. And so, you know how grandparents are. They see the grandchildren, oh, look, that's just like the child. And Steve is recognizing these similarities regarding their grandchildren. Anna Catherine. So at least 3 surviving children, it would appear, in this situation. Anna Catherine, who has a beautiful smile, a radiant personality, and a tenacious determination about life. I can still see Matt smile, see him interacting with people, and remember his, "that's my stance and I'm sticking to it" approach to life. A strong-willed boy, it sounded like. Well, it seems like Anna Catherine may have been one and is one right falling in his footsteps. And so through them, he still speaks. And so how then can there be purpose in this situation? Well, who is most qualified to understand the traits of the adult child that's passed? The parents. Parents reared the child, understand the child, know what worked, what didn't work, so on and so forth. And what a tremendous opportunity and thought to be able to do it all over again, but much earlier on in life. Well, in many ways, that's the opportunity of grandchildren. And so the grandparents can find themselves in a very unique position to be able to now attend to and help serve in this uniquely qualified way, bringing these children up with an intimate knowledge of how they are naturally bent. And I want you to think about Proverbs 22 and verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Some say that the understanding of this passage has to do with the actual bend in a tree. And if you train up a child according to that bend, just like a tree would have a certain bend, then you're going to essentially be guiding that child in biblical principles that are in line with that personality bend. Well, that makes a lot of sense. But as those of us who are parents know, sometimes there's a lot of trial and error. And sometimes it's not until maybe the mid-30s that we finally figure out, oh, I should have done it this way because now I finally figured out that all these other ways don't work. Well, now it's an opportunity potentially to do that with the grandchildren. What a blessing that is. And so let's look at the types of support that can be offered. Training and being a form of the adult child for the grandkid. In other words, this grandchild has now lost daddy, or this grandchild has lost mommy. So the biological mom or dad is no longer going to be there. That role, that void, will need to be attempted to be fulfilled. It never can be perfectly, but attempts can be made. Again, who is better positioned? Now think again about the role of a father. What is it that a father is supposed to do? We think about what Paul tells the Ephesians in Ephesians 6 and verse 4, "And you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." Have you ever known someone to not have their daddy in their life? Have you ever known someone whose life was greatly troubled and there were, let's just say, disciplinary issues because daddy wasn't in their life? Oftentimes, what onlookers will say is, a child needs daddy. That child needs a male figure to step in, take charge, and provide guidance in a way that really only daddy is able to do. Well, daddy can't do it if the adult child was the dad. If the adult child was the son, daddy can't do it. And so grandparents' opportunity. It means maybe it's being a little bit more firm and not being able to truly just give lollipops and cotton candy to the grandchildren. It may mean having to put the law down a little bit more clearly and directly. Maybe even having to discipline and fill those shoes. What about mommy? What if the adult child was the mom, the daughter? Well, in Titus chapter 2, we learn there in verse 4 that they admonished the young women, this is the older women, admonished the young women to love their husbands, to love their children. The love of a mother can never be replaced. And grandparents certainly can provide a certain sense of love and care and comfort, but it's different from mommy's love. Maybe an opportunity to provide the type of support similar to that of the actual parent that has now passed. What about just encouraging Christian faithfulness, encouraging biblical knowledge and training, and connection with God's people? Hey, daddy's not there, or mommy's not there, but what better people are qualified to assist and provide support in that now child's life other than God's people, the church of Christ, the kingdom of God? You think about what Paul tells the Galatians in Galatians chapter 6 there in verse 1, brethren, if any man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. The role of the church is to provide this level of support, this level of safety and security that others simply cannot do. Think also about what Paul will write to the Romans in Romans chapter 12 and verse 15. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. What better community is there to be connected with as it relates to our eternal soul and a sense of understanding regarding the passing of a parent than God's people? What a blessing it is that such is available to us, and what a blessing it can be for grandparents to make that connection for their grandchildren in hopes that they can be properly guided given the missing mother or father throughout their life. We see the types of support. What about the channels of support? What do I mean by channels? How exactly is this support going to be provided? In other words, navigating the surviving spouse's role and involvement that he or she may allow. Some spouses respond in ways where they fully embrace the grandparents' involvement and are eager to have granddad and grandma involved in any way possible, knowing the benefits, of course, to the children and even the home. But others may respond in a way that they want their space. They don't want granddad and grandma to be involved. I mean, you've probably been aware of situations, I'm aware of situations, without even a passing occurring where grandchildren are completely cut off from grandparents in regards to actually visiting and visitation. That can be difficult. And so how then can this be navigated? Well, remember, as we studied previously, as we were looking at this context in Mark chapter 4 regarding the parables of Jesus, there in verse 33, we learn that with many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. And so there is a dance, there is a wisdom aspect to the way in which guidance and advice and training and teaching is provided in view of how it may be received and in view of the surviving spouse and channeling it through or around their presence. Navigating that approach. One of the ways and one of the channels as to how this might be able to be done is through just simply the writing of cards. We've had grandparents write our children, and they have specifically sent them letters, multiple page letters, that are addressing all kinds of matters of life that aren't necessarily relevant to any particular issue that is currently going on, but just by a means of providing some level of instruction in hopes that the child might be aware of the care and the concern that grandma or granddad has for them. Now, that letter can be valuable. That form and that channel of support can be valuable. It may not be read and fully appreciated at the exact moment that the child receives it. It may be later on in years that the child begins to truly and genuinely appreciate what was done. But I want you to think about Paul, for example, and his writing of letters as it relates to Timothy. Paul wrote letters to Timothy. Yes, we have them for our benefit because it was inspired work that we get to use so that we can have eternal life and live godly. But to Timothy, specifically in the context, it was also being written to Timothy for Timothy. And we see in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 13, Paul here telling Timothy, "Till I come, give attention to reading, to exhortation, to doctrine." Notice verse 15. "Meditate on these things, give yourself entirely to them, that your progress may be evident to all." Paul is charging Timothy. Now, yes, he's an apostle. But Timothy is still younger, and he is still one that certainly could shrug this off, but Paul's doing it nonetheless. Grandparents, don't underestimate your influence and the opportunity that you have to help train and guide and instruct your grandchildren. Letters may be a way as to how that can be done. Finally, let's look at the continuation of support. We see the types of support, the channels of support. What about the continuation of support? What do I mean by continuation? Well, the older years, when you get into the teenage years and then the young adult years, it may not be until those moments in life when glaring gaps begin to rise as to the lack of presence of the passing parent. The inability to relate, the inability to identify, the inability to just pick up the phone and text or call and say, "Hey, Mom, what did you do in this situation? Hey, Dad, what did you do in this situation?" That context isn't there. And so there is an opportunity as you think about the seasons of life and the appropriate timing of various contexts. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. There's a benefit in just maintaining an open line of communication to keep the story about the parent that passed and the life that he or she lived, the narrative going. You never know when the need may exist by the child to reach out and seek for guidance in such contexts. You think about, again, what Paul tells the Galatians in Galatians chapter 6. We already saw the blessing of being able to bear one another's burdens, but also notice later on in that same chapter, in verse 9, he says, "And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith." So looking for opportunities, looking for moments by which we can be activated by living the gospel in the lives of others. Well, that can't be done unless we are constantly sowing. We're constantly on pursuit in trying to spread the gospel in the lives of others. Well, you can't do that without a relationship, without a continued open line of communication. You think about the sower and what the sower did. The sower was constantly sowing seed. Luke chapter 8 and verse 5, a sower went out to sow his seed. And our job is to sow seed, and that includes just maintaining those relationships throughout the entire time period of the life of that child, not having any full exact knowledge as to when that child may need that gap regarding the lost parent to be filled and the opportunity that we may have to fill it in some way or another. Through them, he still speaks. looking there at the children, the surviving children of the life of the past adult child. Maybe you're here this afternoon, brother or sister, and you need to repent. You need to be restored. You need prayers of the congregation. We're here to assist you in any way that we can. Maybe you're here and you're not yet a child of God. Won't you make the decision to become one by putting on Christ via baptism, as we read about in Galatians chapter 3, 26 and 27. Jesus commanded that in Mark chapter 16 and verses 15 and 16, and it's exemplified in Acts chapter 8, 34 through 39. Have you obeyed the gospel yet this afternoon? If not, you have the opportunity to do so. If you have any spiritual need, won't you come forward as all together we stand and sing.